Welcome, everyone. My name is Carter Remy, and welcome to my site for the presentation of the influence of previously learned languages. As you can see, we have different greetings here from Haitian Creole to Kaburu Creole. So, without further ado, let's dive into it. Before we really dive into the topic and conversation, let's kind of take a step back. We'll kind of start to dive into the historical approach of SLA because it is a new field and it deals mainly with linguistic, social, and psychological, with the psychological focus on the brain, how language affects the brain, specifically specific learning processes as well as its differences. We'll also dive into the contrastive analysis, which is a juxtaposition of two languages that allows one to examine similarities and differences and how that affects learners' learning ability. We'll look at error analysis in our language, which is like a medium between two languages. We'll also look at a learner's internal syllabi, cross-linguistic, which is in a way a learner making use of what they already know in a previous language to help them in their acquisition of the new language, right? We'll dive into conversations such as innatist behaviors and interactionists and how those have influenced this conversation, right? So starting to look at the historical accounts, we have to go back into the middle to early to middle 1900s, where environmentalists' belief regarding linguistic acquisition was a result of our environment, right? Talk about nature versus nurture. And diving into the 1950s, we start to see behaviors thinking how the impact of L1 and on L2 in the case of this topic as something to overcome. So diving into the middle 1960s, one of the OGs came out to play, being Noam Chomsky, right? With his universal grammar, stating that everyone has an innate ability to learn language. Now, when we go into the 1960s, we'll start talking about Quarter and his famous article of the significance of learner errors, which alluded to the fact that were are made errors made by learners in second language learning and acquisition occurred because a learner is using what we now refer to as an internal syllabus, right? And if we dive a little bit later on in the 70s and 80s, most in the 70s, we start to see Nimzer and Selenker and other folks starting to come into play, mainly Selenker with his inner language article, which talked about, which kind of, in a way, again, inner language is more so, not more so, inner language is a mediator. At least I see it as a mediator between a learner's previously learned language and that of their target language. And we can't forget about interactionists and a prominent one, Vygotsky, which in a way they saw learning on an interaction level for both L1 and L2, right? And diving into the 1980s, and they saw learning as L2 kind of looks and act like L1 learning, right? Now, if we look at the topic in of itself, it's exactly what it is. It's how your previously learned language is affecting the current ones that you're learning. And now one can look at this from two different ways. They can look at it on how the effects of simply knowing many languages, right? In other words, how does that affect you on your learning journey? Or they can look at it as from a cross-linguistic influence perspective. Now, when it comes to the effects and impacts, we see the new and contemporary authors such as Wolf and Ellis and VPA et al. In 2020, looking at or talking about how the effects of a previously learned language cannot be the sole determinant of the L2 of one's L2, right? And this is really helpful to scholars because prior to the present day, behaviorists again was looking at the influence of L1 to be a negative thing. Now, this topic flows very easily into others. We're already talking about errors. We just talked about behaviors and contrastive analysis hypothesis. Researchers made use of that in the past, right? Looking at how to juxtapose native language to target languages, and that is really influential in this. And looking at inner language again with Salinger and how cross linguistic is regarded as the effects of one's using what they know in the previous language to that of their current language, right? So kind of like inner language being a bridge to a new language or a new country, and cross linguistic being kind of like the luggage that you're carrying with you to that language, right? And some of the notable speakers that we're talking about here are authors such as Porter, right, being prominent, especially for his article of learner errors. Vygotsky that we talked about, but he's really prominent for his social cognitive theories, and ZPD, and Selenker that we're talking about with inner language. Now, if we start diving into the research reviews, some of the things that I looked at with an article by Moratarian in 2013, titled Bidirectional Cross-Linguistic Influence in Language Learning, Linguistic Aspects and Beyond. This called for us to consider not only linguistic differences, but also cultural, social, conceptual, and others when we're thinking about a learner, right? Their goal was to have a group translate from L1 to L2 and L2 back to L1. And with their findings there, they talked about different kinds of transfers being reverse transfer, lateral transfer, and things of that nature, or forward transfer, so to speak. And their findings, they found all types of them. Um, and that really kind of raised the conversation to a new level, right? And another article that I took a look at that kind of zoned into the systematic cross-linguistic meta-analysis by Yang and et al. In 2017, really their goal um, was to look at a cross-linguistic meta-analysis between English and Chinese, right? And their findings was that English and Chinese do share linguistic features that allow for transfer between both languages, right? For me, what I found interesting was that and I quote, studies have revealed that bilingual kids' linguistic skills, such as morphological awareness, do predict their acquisition in English literacy. Contribution to the SLA field, really it connects what the topics we're already talking about, and the course, or we've talked about in the course, such as usage model or the complex system approach, so to speak, and in a way that the linguistic skills of the youth is multifaceted, right? And last but not least, I looked at an article by Sokolova et al., right, in 2019. Sokolova et al. Conducted an experiment in which three production tasks was used, such as oral, written, and pronunciation. Now, their findings showed highlights of how each group's foreign language affects their oral and or written or pronunciation tasks, right? And now when it comes to SLA, such as the conversation we've been having, this article really helped to conclude that learners of English, as there are three, are influenced by both their previous language and various other contributions that this is having to the conversation, and that's quite influential, so to speak. Now, when we dive into the discussion of it all, uh, we can start talking about language proximity, right? And that's in a way the ability to draw on conversations and thought processes from a previously learned language to understand a new language, so to speak, or acquire or use to acquire a new language. Now, what does that mean for learners? When it comes to language proximities, learners will have a much easier time to understand speakers from different countries, and as well as when they are attempting to learn a language. So for me, if I already know Spanish, it'll be a bit easier to acquire Portuguese or converted Creole because they do share proximity of one another, so to speak. Um, and for researchers, this is calling for an investigation, right, to understand how the brain operates. Now, I did have a video set up for the second topic conversation, which is Southern language amnesia, but I was not able to put that on here on the website. But I was able to put a link. So whenever you have a chance, do click on the link and take a watch and take a listen. And really, Southern language amnesia is talking about the inability to recall words, sentences, or phrases in a language that you want to. But you are able to think about it in other languages, so to speak. Now, when it comes to the connection to theories and of this topic, right? This can be looked at from various different ways, from connecting it to the CAH, to error analysis, recast, because when we do forget those words, they do have to be recasted back to us from various different ways, and this also could connect to error analysis, but perhaps in a new way, because in quarter 1967, the notion of transitional competence was brought up, urging folks to make a distinction in errors, right? And then also CAH again, really to help to analyze some of those differences and similarities amongst languages that may occur. Now, the last discussion is in regards to implicit and explicit learning, so to speak, looking at an article by Batlon and et al. That explored three various experiments of the relationship between implicit and explicit learning, where it was reported that indeed previously learned language do influence implicit learning. I was shocked by that, I tell you. When it comes to the impact of learners and researchers would have to look at how far this goes and the potential tangents that it may carry. As for learners, this could mean an additional method to add to their toolbar, right? Now, looking at the application and reflection, for me, this was an interchangeable exchange where it has this topic has opened my eyes to many aspects of the influence of previously learned language, because what I find most fascinating was that most folks, including academics and the masses, they often stop focusing on the influence of previously learned language after L1, right? So meaning L4 has no effect on L2. And again, going back to the great debate of implicit and explicit learning, that was also quite fascinating to me. Now, connecting this back to the program timeline, so this topic really kind of helped me see on a broader scale of how intertwined, interconnected, and multifaceted these things are. Now, connecting this back to my experience, I am not a teacher by no means. I am a youth educator, however. I mainly work in the after school sector. So I'll definitely take what I've learned in here um, to kind of propel me to move forward. And I also mainly work with monolingual speakers, right? I don't often work with bilingual, multilingual speakers, but I will make sure to utilize what I've learned here to move forward, so to speak. Now, when it comes to this topic, I do find myself making use of inner language and language proximity. As I noted earlier, I am currently learning various languages such as Criollo and Portuguese. Now, when it comes to future application, this will really connect well to my personal research project that will enable me to look at Black immigrants and their linguistic readiness from a new facet. Now, some things we're going to talk about are gender differences. We used to live in a binary society. Now things are changing. So we didn't really look at gender, sex, and all those things and how that may or may not influence the previously learned language. We also didn't look at age. I've peppered here and there a couple things about age, but not really in depth. So that's definitely a stone that was left unturned. Some questions I still have are, to what extent do newly acquired languages influence previously learned languages, right? Now, when it comes to the great debate of implicit and explicit learning, do previously learned languages influence implicit learning more so than explicit learning? Or is it the other way around? I don't know. In the case of language proximity and previously learned language, is there a greater influence of previously learned language on closely related languages, or those are in proximity to each other? Now, when it comes to, again, this topic, what does the influence of previously learned languages look like if and when the learner is learning more than one language simultaneously? Again, in my case with Criollo and Portuguese, if a learner is learning two languages at the same time, what would the influence of their previously learned languages look like for the new language that they're learning? This brings the presentation to a close. This is the glossary that I've worked with. It has all, if not most of the terminologies that we've talked about, including some of the others we didn't touch on. Um, and this is the reference page. Thanks for listening and or watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.